The mess hall at Naval Base Coronado buzzed with the usual dinner crowd chatter. Steam rose from metal trays filled with mashed potatoes and mystery meat that sailors had learned not to question too closely. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across rows of long tables where dozens of service members sat hunched over their meals. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez walked through the serving line with measured steps, her uniform crisp despite the long day of training exercises. At 5 feet 6 inches, she carried herself with quiet confidence that came from years of pushing beyond what others thought possible. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes took in everything around her, with the kind of awareness that had kept her alive in places most people never knew existed. She had arrived at Coronado 3 weeks earlier for a temporary assignment, part of a joint training exercise between different special operations units. What the other personnel on base didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just any Navy officer. She was a member of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world, though her presence here was kept deliberately low-key. The SEAL teams had only recently begun allowing women into their ranks after years of legal battles and policy changes. Sarah was among the first to complete the grueling training program that broke most men who attempted it. The statistics were brutal. Less than 20% of candidates made it through basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, and the numbers were even lower for the advanced programs that followed. As she moved through the line, loading her tray with the standard military fare, Sarah noticed 3 soldiers sitting at a corner table. They wore Army uniforms and had been watching her since she entered. Their conversation stopped when she passed, and she caught fragments of whispered comments that made her jaw tighten slightly. The 3 men were part of a Ranger unit visiting for the same joint exercise. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson was the apparent leader of the group, a thick-shouldered man from Texas with arms covered in tattoos that told stories of deployments across the Middle East. His companions were Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez and Corporal Jake Williams, both younger, but carrying the same swagger that came with being part of an elite military unit. Thompson had been vocal about his opinions regarding women in combat roles, especially in special operations. He believed the standards had been lowered to accommodate political correctness, and he wasn't shy about sharing these views with anyone who would listen. When he saw Sarah in her Navy uniform, he assumed she was just another regular officer trying to play in what he considered a man's world. Sarah found an empty table near the windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a stark contrast to the institutional beige of the mess hall interior. She ate methodically, her mind already focused on the next day's training schedule. The joint exercise would test coordination between different branches and units, something that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure in real-world scenarios. The 3 soldiers finished their meals and stood up, their chairs scraping against the linoleum floor. Thompson looked toward Sarah's table and made a decision that would prove to be a significant miscalculation. He nudged his companions and jerked his head in her direction. They approached with the kind of casual arrogance that often preceded trouble. Thompson took the lead, his heavy boots announcing their arrival before he even spoke. The mess hall was still busy enough that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by most people, which was exactly what Thompson was counting on. Sarah sensed their approach before she looked up. Years of training had honed her situational awareness to a razor's edge. She could track multiple threats simultaneously while appearing completely relaxed, a skill that had saved her life more than once in hostile territory. When the 3 soldiers reached her table, Thompson leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the surface. His voice carried the tone of someone used to intimidating others through physical presence alone. He suggested that perhaps Sarah might be more comfortable eating with the other support staff, implying that the main dining area was reserved for real soldiers. Rodriguez chimed in with comments about how some people needed to understand their place in the military hierarchy. Williams, the youngest of the 3, seemed less comfortable with the situation, but went along with his superiors, making remarks about how certain people were only on base because of quotas and political pressure. Sarah continued eating without looking up, her movements steady and controlled. She took a sip of water from her plastic cup and finally raised her eyes to meet Thompson's gaze. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, when she asked if they had finished their meal and were ready to return to their quarters. The dismissive tone caught Thompson off guard. He had expected defensiveness, anger, or intimidation. Instead, he found himself looking into eyes that held no fear whatsoever. There was something unsettling about her complete lack of reaction to their obvious attempt to provoke her. Thompson decided to escalate the situation. He commented on how some people needed to learn respect for their betters, and perhaps a lesson in military courtesy was in order. Rodriguez moved to block the path to the exit, while Williams positioned himself on the other side of the table. They weren't making overt threats, but their intent was clear enough to anyone paying attention. Sarah set down her fork and folded her hands on the table. The gesture appeared relaxed, but anyone with training would recognize the ready position it created. She asked the three soldiers if they were familiar with the concept of situational awareness, a question that seemed oddly specific given the circumstances. The mess hall continued its normal rhythm around them. Other diners were absorbed in their own conversations and meals, mostly unaware of the tension building at the corner table. A few people glanced over occasionally, but the interaction still appeared relatively casual to outside observers. Thompson's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't used to people who refused to be intimidated, especially not junior officers who should know better than to challenge NCOs with his experience. He made the mistake of reaching toward Sarah's shoulder, intending to emphasize his point through physical contact. What happened next would later be described in incident reports as an unexpected escalation, resulting in multiple injuries to Army personnel. The reality was far more dramatic than those dry official words could convey. The moment Thompson's hand moved toward her, Sarah's training kicked in with devastating efficiency. Years of conditioning had programmed specific responses into her muscle memory, reactions that occurred faster than conscious thought. She had spent countless hours practicing techniques designed to neutralize threats in confined spaces, exactly like the situation she now faced. The three soldiers had made a fundamental error in their assessment of who they were dealing with. They saw a lone female officer and assumed vulnerability where none existed. They had walked into what they thought was a simple intimidation scenario, but had actually cornered one of the most dangerous individuals on the entire base. The moment Thompson's fingers were inches from Sarah's shoulder, her body moved with precision that defied normal human reaction time. Her left hand shot up and caught his wrist in a grip that immediately sent shooting pain up his arm. Before he could process what was happening, she had twisted his arm into a position that forced him to bend forward awkwardly to avoid having his shoulder dislocated. The movement was so smooth and quick that the other diners didn't immediately realize what had occurred. To casual observers, it might have looked like Thompson had simply leaned down to whisper something to the seated officer. Rodriguez reacted first among Thompson's companions, moving forward to help his sergeant. This proved to be another miscalculation. Sarah's right leg swept out in a controlled arc that caught Rodriguez behind the knee, sending him stumbling backward into an empty chair. The metal furniture clattered as he fought to maintain his balance. Williams hesitated, suddenly realizing that the situation had shifted dramatically. The woman they had approached to intimidate was now controlling his sergeant with what appeared to be minimal effort, while Rodriguez scrambled to regain his footing. The casual confidence they had felt minutes earlier evaporated as they found themselves facing something entirely unexpected. Sarah maintained her grip on Thompson's wrist while speaking in the same calm tone she had used throughout the encounter. She suggested that the three soldiers might want to reconsider their current course of action, as it was leading them toward consequences they were not prepared to handle. Thompson tried to pull his arm free, using his considerable strength advantage. The attempt only resulted in more pain as Sarah adjusted her grip and leverage. Years of training against larger, stronger opponents had taught her how to use anatomy and physics to overcome raw power. She could maintain control of his arm indefinitely, without exerting significant effort. The mess hall was beginning to take notice now. Conversations at nearby tables had quieted as people turned to see what was causing the commotion. A few senior NCOs from various branches had spotted the disturbance and were moving closer, though they couldn't yet tell exactly what was happening. Rodriguez had regained his balance and was considering whether to escalate further. His training told him to help his fellow soldier, but his instincts were warning him that something was very wrong with this entire situation. The woman's movements had been too precise, too practiced. This wasn't someone who had learned basic self-defense in a weekend course. Sarah seemed to read his hesitation. Without releasing Thompson's wrist, She shifted slightly in her chair and made eye contact with Rodriguez. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her gaze made him take an involuntary step backward. It was the look of a predator evaluating prey, calculating distances and reaction times. Williams found his voice first. He asked what was happening, his tone revealing the confusion and growing concern he felt. The confident swagger that had carried them to this table had been replaced by uncertainty. This wasn't how these situations usually went. Sarah released Thompson's wrist without warning, the sudden freedom causing him to stumble backward a step. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. At her full height, she was still shorter than all three soldiers, but somehow her presence seemed to fill more space than it should have. She walked around the table toward the three men, her posture relaxed but purposeful. Thompson rubbed his wrist, trying to restore circulation while processing what had just happened. His fingers were already showing red marks where her grip had compressed blood vessels and pressure points with surgical precision. The watching crowd was growing larger now. Word had spread through the mess hall that something unusual was happening, though most people still couldn't see the full scope of what had transpired. Military personnel were naturally curious about confrontations, especially ones involving different branches of service. Sarah stopped directly in front of Thompson, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried just enough volume for the three soldiers to hear clearly, but not enough to reach the growing audience around them. She asked Thompson if he had ever heard of something called the Trident. The question seemed random given the context, but there was something about the way she asked it that suggested deeper significance. The Trident was the golden emblem worn by Navy SEALs, one of the most recognizable symbols of elite military achievement. Thompson's expression shifted slightly. As a ranger, he was familiar with special operations insignia from all branches. The Trident represented a level of training and capability that commanded respect throughout the military community, regardless of personal opinions about other issues. Rodriguez was studying Sarah more carefully now, looking for details he had missed during their initial assessment. Her uniform was standard Navy issue, but there were subtle indicators that suggested she wasn't regular personnel. Her boots were slightly different from standard issue, worn in patterns that suggested extensive tactical training. Her posture and movement patterns were those of someone with advanced combat experience. Sarah continued her questioning, asking if any of them had ever wondered what it took to earn the right to wear that particular piece of metal. She described the training process in general terms that anyone could have researched, but the way she spoke suggested personal familiarity with details that weren't commonly known. The SEAL training pipeline was legendary for its brutality. Basic underwater demolition. SEAL training had a failure rate that eliminated the vast majority of candidates. Those who survived that phase faced additional months of specialized instruction in everything from close-quarters combat to advanced demolitions. The physical requirements alone were enough to break most people, but the mental challenges were often even more demanding. Williams was starting to understand the implications of Sarah's questions. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made their earlier behavior seem incredibly foolish. If this woman was suggesting what he thought she was suggesting, they had just attempted to intimidate one of the most highly trained warriors in the entire military. Thompson was slower to grasp the situation, still focused on the pain in his wrist and the humiliation of being controlled so easily. He demanded to know what point Sarah was trying to make with her questions about special operations training. Sarah smiled for the first time since the encounter began, but it wasn't a particularly warm expression. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her military identification card, holding it so the three soldiers could see the information printed there. The document confirmed what they were beginning to suspect but had been too proud to consider possible. The ID clearly showed Sarah's name, rank, and unit designation. More importantly, it listed qualifications and specialties that made Rodriguez whistle softly under his breath. Thompson's face went pale as he read the small print that detailed training completions and operational certifications. Sarah was indeed a Navy SEAL, one of the first women to complete the full training pipeline and earn the right to wear the Trident. The regular Navy officer they had chosen to harass was actually a member of one of the most elite fighting forces on the planet. She had completed the same training that broke 90% of male candidates, and had done so while facing additional challenges and scrutiny that her male counterparts never had to endure. The mess hall around them had gone noticeably quieter as more people became aware that something significant was happening. Senior officers from multiple branches were now paying attention, though they were maintaining enough distance to avoid interfering, unless the situation escalated further. Sarah put her ID away and looked at each of the 3 soldiers in turn. She explained that she had tried to handle their approach quietly and professionally, giving them multiple opportunities to reconsider their behavior before things went too far. Unfortunately, they had chosen to persist in a course of action that forced her to respond appropriately. Thompson was struggling with the revelation. His worldview had been built around certain assumptions about capability and combat effectiveness that were now crumbling in real time. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified had just demonstrated skills that exceeded his own by a significant margin. Rodriguez was already thinking about damage control. As an experienced NCO, he understood that this situation could have serious career implications for all 3 of them. Attempting to intimidate a SEAL officer was not something that would be overlooked by their chain of command, especially given the circumstances and the growing audience of witnesses. The confrontation had reached a turning point. What happened next would determine whether this remained a teachable moment or became something much more serious. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched for several heartbeats. Thompson stared at the spot where her ID had been, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. Rodriguez was looking around the mess hall, acutely aware of how many people were now watching their table. Williams seemed frozen in place. Caught between his loyalty to his fellow soldiers and the growing realization of how badly they had misjudged the situation, Sarah took a step back, giving the 3 men space to process what had happened. Her posture remained relaxed, but there was no mistaking the readiness in her stance. She had made her point without escalating to serious violence. But everyone present understood that she was more than capable of defending herself if the situation deteriorated further. A new voice cut through the tension from across the room. Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan was approaching their table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. He was a 25-year Navy veteran with multiple deployments and a reputation for being both fair and uncompromising when it came to military standards. Sullivan had been eating dinner with several other senior enlisted personnel when the confrontation began. As one of the few people in the mess hall who was familiar with Sarah's actual background, he had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. When he saw her show her identification to the 3 soldiers, he decided it was time to intervene before things went too far in either direction. He stopped next to the table and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. His voice carried the authority that came with decades of military service when he asked if there was a problem that needed to be addressed. Thompson found his voice first, though it took him several attempts to form coherent words. He began to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. But his explanation trailed off, as he realized how inadequate any excuse would sound, given what they now knew about Sarah's qualifications. Rodriguez stepped forward and took responsibility for the group's behavior. As the senior NCO among the 3 soldiers, he knew it was his job to handle the situation professionally, regardless of how it had started. He acknowledged that they had approached Lieutenant Martinez inappropriately and offered an apology for their conduct. Master Chief Sullivan listened to the brief explanation while studying each person's demeanor. Years of experience had taught him to read between the lines of what people said and focus on what they didn't say. The body language around the table told him most of what he needed to know about how the confrontation had unfolded. Sarah spoke up for the first time since revealing her identity. She told Sullivan that the situation had been handled and that no further action was necessary on her part. Her tone was professional and calm, suggesting that she considered the matter resolved as long as there were no additional incidents. The Master Chief nodded but made it clear that there would be some follow-up conversations with the appropriate chain of command. Incidents involving personnel from different branches required documentation, especially when they occurred during joint training exercises. The Army unit would need to address their soldiers' conduct through their own channels. Williams finally found the courage to speak directly to Sarah. His voice was quiet and sincere when he apologized for his part in what had happened. He admitted that they had made assumptions about her based on her appearance and gender, assumptions that had proven to be completely wrong. Sarah accepted the apology with a simple nod. She understood the psychology behind what had occurred, having faced similar situations before. Many people found it difficult to reconcile their preconceptions about women in combat roles with the reality of what individuals like herself had accomplished. Education was usually more effective than confrontation in changing those attitudes. The crowd that had gathered around their table was beginning to disperse as it became clear that the situation was being resolved peacefully. Conversations gradually returned to normal topics, though there would be plenty of discussion about what people had witnessed throughout the rest of the evening. Thompson was struggling with emotions he wasn't equipped to handle. His identity had been built around being part of an elite military unit, and his opinions about women in combat had been challenged in the most direct way possible. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his own, forcing him to confront the possibility that his beliefs might be wrong. Master Chief Sullivan addressed the three soldiers directly, making it clear that their behavior reflected poorly on their unit and their branch of service. He reminded them that joint exercises were opportunities to build cooperation and mutual respect, not to settle personal grievances or prove points about gender roles. Sarah gathered her meal tray and prepared to leave. Before departing, she offered a final comment to the three soldiers. She explained that earning the right to wear any special operations insignia required dedication, sacrifice, and capabilities that couldn't be judged by appearance alone. The standards were the same for everyone, regardless of gender, and those standards were maintained because lives depended on them. She wished them success in the remainder of the joint exercise and walked away toward the dish return area. Her departure was as controlled and professional as everything else she had done during the encounter. Several people in the mess hall watched her go, many of them seeing her differently than they had when she first entered. Rodriguez turned to his companions once Sarah was out of earshot. He made it clear that they needed to have a serious discussion about what had just happened and how they were going to handle the inevitable questions from their leadership. Their behavior had been inappropriate by any standard, and the consequences would likely extend beyond simple embarrassment. Thompson was slowly coming to terms with the reality of what he had experienced. The person he had attempted to intimidate possessed skills and training that made his own accomplishments seem modest by comparison. More importantly, she had demonstrated professionalism and restraint that he was beginning to recognize as true strength. Master Chief Sullivan remained at the table for several more minutes, ensuring that the situation was completely diffused before returning to his own meal. He made mental notes about what he had observed, knowing that accurate reporting would be essential when the inevitable follow-up meetings occurred. The three soldiers eventually left the mess hall, their earlier confidence replaced by a soberness that comes with learning difficult lessons about assumptions and respect. The joint exercise would continue for another week, providing them with opportunities to demonstrate better judgment and professional behavior. Word of the incident spread through the base over the following days, though the details became increasingly distorted as the story was retold. Some versions portrayed Sarah as having defeated multiple attackers in hand-to-hand combat, while others focused on the soldiers' embarrassment at discovering her true identity. The reality was more nuanced than either extreme suggested. The official incident report was brief and factual, noting that Army personnel had approached a Navy officer inappropriately, and that the situation had been resolved without injury or further escalation. Master Chief Sullivan's additional comments provided context about the professionalism displayed by Lieutenant Martinez and the learning opportunity the incident represented for all involved personnel. Thompson spent considerable time over the following days reflecting on his attitudes and beliefs. The encounter had forced him to confront prejudices he hadn't fully recognized in himself. He began to understand that his opposition to women in combat roles might have been based more on assumptions than facts. Rodriguez used the incident as a teaching moment for younger soldiers in his unit. He emphasized the importance of treating all military personnel with respect and professionalism, regardless of personal opinions about policy decisions. The military's effectiveness depended on cooperation and mutual respect among all its members. Williams found himself curious about the SEAL training program and the individuals who completed it successfully. He began researching the requirements and standards, developing a new appreciation for the dedication required to earn special operations qualifications. His respect for Sarah's accomplishments grew as he learned more about what she had endured to reach her current position. Sarah continued her duties on base, without dwelling on the confrontation. She had faced similar challenges throughout her career, and had learned to handle them as professional obstacles, rather than personal attacks. Her focus remained on the training exercises and the mission requirements that had brought her to Coronado. The joint exercise concluded successfully, with all participating units demonstrating improved coordination and communication. The incident in the mess hall became part of the base's unofficial history, serving as a reminder about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and treating all personnel with appropriate respect. Years later, when Thompson had advanced in rank and responsibility, he would sometimes tell the story to younger soldiers as an example of how assumptions could lead to serious mistakes. He learned to speak about women in combat roles with knowledge rather than prejudice, having experienced firsthand what dedication and training could accomplish regardless of gender. The mess hall at Naval Base Coronado returned to its normal routine, but the lessons learned from that evening continued to influence the people who had witnessed what happened. Sometimes the most important education occurs not in classrooms or training facilities, but in moments when reality challenges our preconceptions and forces us to grow beyond our limitations.